My parents hid the luxurious wedding they organized for my sister in Hawaii from me because I was still working to support them. My life had always been about sacrifice. From an early age, I learned that the world didn't revolve around me. It didn't revolve around my dreams, my desires, or even my needs. It was about my parents, my future, and making sure I could support them in their old age. My older sister was the golden child, always the center of attention, always basking in our parents' love. They adored her. To them, she was their pride and joy, while I was just there, the one who had to work hard for everything, the one who had to focus on school and prepare for a future that I never chose but was expected to fulfill. It wasn't an easy role, but I accepted it. There didn't seem to be any other option. My whole existence revolved around the quiet background. My life, my identity, was shaped by the fact that I had to do well in school to eventually take care of them. I didn't have the luxury of pursuing a carefree life. My summers weren't spent at parties or hanging out with friends. No, I worked 2 part-time jobs to help pay the bills, so my parents wouldn't have to worry about money. And I sacrificed my own social life for studying because I was told, again and again, that my success would be the family's ticket to a better future. I was sitting in my tiny room one afternoon, buried under textbooks and notes, utterly exhausted from another long study session. I needed a break. But instead of getting rest, I did what I always did when I wanted to distract myself. I opened my phone and started scrolling through social media. My eyes were tired, but my mind was restless. That's when I saw the post that would change everything. There was my sister, standing in an elegant dress, surrounded by a group of people. It was her engagement party. And the caption said everything. "Can't wait to celebrate our wedding in Hawaii with all our loved ones." A sinking feeling hit me in the gut. I was not among those loved ones. In fact, I wasn't even mentioned. Not a single word. My parents were there, of course, dressed to the nines, beaming proudly beside my sister, as if they had won some kind of lottery. There were other relatives, too. People I hadn't seen in years. All of them toasting with champagne, laughing, and celebrating. Everyone was there, everyone but me. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the fact that they were having a celebration without telling me. It was the fact that they didn't even think to include me. My sister, who had always treated me like a stranger, didn't even bother to send me a message. And my parents, the same parents who had always preached the importance of family, hadn't considered me family enough to invite me. It stung more than I could put into words. You see, this wasn't the first time they had treated me like an afterthought. Over the years, I had been nothing more than a tool to them, a means to an end. I had spent summers working, studying late into the night, skipping time with friends all so I could excel in school, so I could make them proud. And for what? So that I could be reminded once again that, when it came to my sister, I was dispensable. I could feel the anger rising in me. I wanted answers. I wanted an explanation. How could they do this to me? How could they be so indifferent? I grabbed my phone and called them. The dial tone echoed in my ears. And then, voicemail. I tried again, but it was the same. Voicemail again and again. What was the point of calling my sister? What could she possibly say that would make any of this okay? She would either ignore me completely or offer some weak excuse that would only make me feel worse. The truth hit me hard, harder than I had ever wanted to admit. They didn't care about me, not in the way they cared about her. I was just the person who had to sacrifice everything for their future. I was nothing more than a convenient tool to ensure that they could one day retire comfortably. That was my role in their eyes, and I had known it for years. But it still hurt every time. 2 days passed. The silence was deafening. I couldn't help but feel abandoned. Then, I received the first message from my parents. A reminder to keep studying, to focus on my future. The usual. I almost pressed the mute button right then and there. But for some reason, I hesitated. Why did I hesitate? I should have muted them right away. But I didn't. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the screen. Then, I silenced their numbers. I did the same with my sister. Maybe I was done. Maybe I had finally had enough. I had given them everything, my time, my effort, my entire life, and they had never once treated me like I mattered. So, I stopped needing them. I stopped caring about their approval. And I wasn't going to waste another minute of my life chasing their love. Time passed. I focused on my studies, on work, on moving forward with my life without them. But that didn't mean I had forgotten what had happened. It wasn't easy to just let it all go. I kept my phone on silent for a while, my inbox filling up with messages from my father. He was worried. He wanted to know why I hadn't replied. He sounded calm, almost sweet, as if nothing had changed. My mother's messages started out the same, but soon they turned passive aggressive. She reminded me of all the things they had done for me, the meals they had prepared for my birthday, the college they had helped me with, though. In reality, I had worked to pay for it. My father's messages followed the same pattern, guilt tripping me for not answering. They did what they always did. They made me feel guilty. They accused me of being spoiled, of not appreciating the sacrifices they had made. You're so focused on studying that you can't even reply to your parents, they said. It was the same old song and dance. I was tired of hearing it. The fact that they could still make me feel guilty after everything they had done to me, after everything I had learned, was almost laughable. But it wasn't funny. It was infuriating. Then, out of nowhere, I heard from my cousin. She wasn't someone I spoke to often, but I knew she had been at the engagement party. She asked why I hadn't been there, and I explained everything. I told her how my parents had made it sound like my absence was my choice, that it was my responsibility to stay behind and focus on my studies for the family's future. But my cousin had heard more than that. She told me something that shook me to my core. Apparently, my parents' wedding plans weren't just extravagant, they were a disaster waiting to happen. They had drained all their retirement savings to fund the wedding and taken out a second mortgage. My father had even joked at the engagement party about how my staying behind helped them save money. In that moment, everything clicked. I wasn't invited because it was cheaper not to invite me. My sister's wedding wasn't about love. It was about securing their financial future, and I was nothing but a pawn in their game. That night, I sat in my room and drafted a message to my parents. I wrote it the way they had always spoken to me. I told them that I had sacrificed my entire life for them, that I had worked summers to support them, that I had given up everything to ensure they would have a better future. But now, I was done. They had used me. They had treated me like a tool, and it was time for me to stop pretending I was okay with it. When I pressed send, I expected them to reply quickly, maybe within hours, but the silence stretched on for days. Then, one morning, I finally received their response. It was everything I had feared: cold, condescending, accusatory. They called me ungrateful. They reminded me of all the things they had done for me. They accused me of acting like a spoiled child. I didn't reply. There was no point. They would never understand. And that was when I realized I had been fighting for their love my whole life. But now, I didn't need it anymore. And it felt good. The days that followed felt like a blur, a strange combination of numbness and clarity. I had silenced their calls, ignored their messages, and distanced myself from the toxic cycle I had been trapped in for years. But the guilt that I had carried for so long, guilt about not meeting their expectations, about not being the child they had wanted me to be, was finally beginning to fade. It was like I had removed a weight that had been pressing down on me for most of my life. Despite my resolve to stop letting their expectations control me, it wasn't long before my inbox was flooded again. It started with a message from my father, then my mother, and then another message from my father. They were worried about me, they said. They wanted to know why I hadn't answered their calls or messages. They sounded almost sweet at first, as though nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just completely excluded me from my sister's engagement and wedding plans. But I knew better. It was all a facade. Their tone quickly shifted. The messages grew more passive-aggressive, dripping with guilt. My mother, in particular, had a way of twisting everything to make me feel like I was in the wrong. She spoke about how they had prepared special meals for me on my birthdays, which, in reality, had always felt more like obligations than celebrations. She even mentioned how they had helped me with college. I didn't even respond. I knew she was talking about the few times they'd chipped in, but most of my tuition was paid for with my own hard work. It wasn't as if they had funded my education. I was the one working those 2 part-time jobs every summer to make sure I didn't graduate with a mountain of debt. My father's messages were similar, just another attempt to make me feel guilty for not responding to them. "We did all of this for you," he wrote, "and you can't even reply to our messages." It was like they couldn't comprehend why I was upset. Their idea of family was about obligation, not love. It was about what I could give them, not what they could give me. I couldn't take it anymore. This constant manipulation, the guilt tripping, the way they had used me as a tool to secure their future, as if I were nothing more than an investment. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Then, my cousin reached out to me. We weren't close, but we had been close growing up, and I knew she had been at the engagement party. She messaged me, asking why I hadn't been there. I told her the truth, that I wasn't invited. I explained how my parents had made it seem like I chose to stay behind and study, that I was the one who had to sacrifice for the family's future. But my cousin told me something that made my stomach drop. She said that my parents had gone even further than I had realized. They had drained their retirement savings to pay for the wedding. They had even taken out a second mortgage on their house. My father had joked at the engagement party about how my staying behind to study was helping them save money. It made sense now. They hadn't invited me because it would have cost too much, and they had convinced me that my studying was supposed to be for them, my future. Success was supposed to secure their retirement. Everything clicked into place. It wasn't about me being the good child or supporting them. It was about my sister's wedding being an expensive spectacle that they couldn't afford. They were relying on me, and yet, I was the one they pushed aside when they needed to make things work. I was just a pawn in their plan. That night, I sat in my room and typed out a message to my parents. I wasn't going to hold back. I wanted them to hear the truth, even if they didn't like it. I told them how much I had sacrificed, how I had spent my summers working to help pay the bills, how I had skipped so many social opportunities just to make them proud, just to ensure I had a future that would help them in theirs. I told them that I had worked so hard my whole life for them, and this was how they repaid me. But I wasn't expecting anything from them. I didn't need an apology, because I knew I wouldn't get one. They didn't see me as their daughter. They saw me as their golden ticket, the one who would provide for them when the time came. So I hit send, and I waited. But the silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. Days passed with no response. At first, I felt frustrated, then a strange sense of calm. I had said my piece, and now I was waiting for them to come to terms with what they had done. But the silence felt too long. I started to think maybe they just didn't care. Then, one morning, I received a message. It was from my parents, but it was nothing like what I had hoped for. Their response was cold and distant. They accused me of being ungrateful, of being selfish, of acting like a spoiled child because I didn't attend the wedding. My father said I needed to stop playing the victim and focus on my studies. And my mother added that family obligations come with sacrifices. They said I wasn't making those sacrifices. I didn't even bother to read the rest. I knew what was coming. It was the same old story. I wasn't the perfect child. I wasn't living up to their expectations. I had let them down. And I was done with it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. They didn't care about me as a person, only as a means to an end. I was their ticket to a comfortable future, and they didn't understand why I had stopped playing along. More time passed, and the distance between me and my family grew. I focused on myself, on my work, on my own future. I realized I didn't need their approval anymore. But then, out of nowhere, my cousin called me again. She said my parents were in deep financial trouble. They had lost their house. Their retirement savings were gone, and now they were begging her for help. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I had always known that they were relying on me for my future success, but to hear it like this, it was different. They were struggling, and now they wanted me to bail them out. I had been there for them in every way I could, but they had never truly been there for me. I was just a pawn in their game of survival. Then, it happened. My sister called me, crying, asking for forgiveness. She said her life had fallen apart after the wedding. She and her husband were in debt, and my parents had promised to help them. Now, my sister was asking me to help them get back on their feet, but I wasn't interested. I told her that if they hadn't considered me family all these years, then I had no obligation to help them. She begged me to forget everything, to forgive her, to forgive them. But I was done. I reminded her that this wasn't my circus, and those weren't my monkeys. I continued to receive calls, messages, and emails from them, apologies wrapped in guilt, requests for help disguised as pleas. But I ignored them all. They had built their own mess, and it wasn't my job to clean it up. Then one day, my mother sent one final message. She said, "We're sorry. Please don't abandon us. I was sorry too, but I had to abandon them. I had done enough. I had become the person they wanted me to be. But now, I was ready to live for myself." As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing more and more detached from my parents and sister. The emotional weight I had carried for so long was starting to lift, but it was replaced by a sense of bitterness and disillusionment. I had spent my entire life living in the shadows of their expectations, sacrificing my happiness, my time, and my dreams for the sake of a future that was never truly mine. But now, with each passing day, I realized that I no longer had to be part of their narrative. I had silenced my family's calls, ignored their messages, and cut off the toxic cycle they had created. At first, it felt strange, like I was severing a part of myself. But then, I realized that what I had been clinging to wasn't love, it was control. They never truly saw me for who I was. I was just a means to an end, a tool to make their lives easier, and it wasn't going to work for me anymore. One evening, after weeks of silence, I opened my laptop and wrote to my parents. I wasn't trying to win them back or force them to apologize. I was simply stating the truth. I told them I owed them nothing. Unlike my sister, I hadn't relied on their financial support for years. I reminded them of how they had pushed me aside for the wedding, how they had drained their savings and taken out a second mortgage. They hadn't invited me because it was cheaper not to. I wasn't there because they made a conscious choice to exclude me from the celebration. It wasn't my decision to stay behind, it was theirs. I told them I was done with pretending, done with playing the role they had assigned me. I was over 18, capable of taking care of myself, and I didn't need them to control my life anymore. They could lean on my sister for whatever came next, whether that was money or support. I reminded them that if my sister's marriage didn't work out, they would need all the help they could get. And they had invested far too much in that relationship to let it fail. When I hit send on that email, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. I knew they wouldn't respond well, but it was out there now, my truth. And I didn't need their validation, as expected. The next morning, I received a message from my parents, but I didn't even bother reading it. I deleted it immediately, knowing it would be just more of the same: guilt tripping, accusations, gaslighting. They had nothing new to say, nothing that would change how I felt. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. I debated whether to answer, but I was curious to hear what she had to say. Her tone was as condescending as ever. But this time, there was something different about it. She told me that the wedding wasn't about me, that I had no right to feel excluded. It was my sister's day, she said, and my sister had chosen who would attend. She went on to justify everything. "You shouldn't be upset," she said, "because it was just her wedding, and she had the right to choose." I couldn't hold back anymore. I asked her how she would feel if the roles were reversed. What if my sister had invited me and not told them about it? What if she mocked them at her wedding, making jokes about how much money they could save by excluding them? How would she feel if that happened? I asked her if it was true family that only considered you family when it was convenient for them. She tried to defend herself, claiming that my father had been careful with what he ate lately, and that she had only drunk 10 glasses of wine at a birthday party, not that much. Right. I couldn't believe she was even trying to justify herself, so I cut her off. I told her that if she wanted to continue playing favorites, that was her choice, but I wasn't going to play along anymore. My life was mine to live, and I didn't need them in it if they couldn't see me for who I really was. I hung up, feeling the last remnants of guilt slip away. Not even 5 minutes later, my father called. His voice was louder this time, angrier. He was furious, not just about what I had said, but because my mother had apparently told him what I thought of him. She had described him as a glutton, and me as the ungrateful child who wouldn't show up when they needed me most. He ranted and raved about how family was supposed to stick together, about how I should never abandon them, no matter what. But I was done with his sermons. I was done with the expectations. I reminded him that respect is earned, not demanded. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their respect, but they had never once treated me like an equal. They had used me as a financial asset, nothing more. I told him I was done trying to win their approval. I was done trying to meet their impossible expectations. And I told him that wherever they ended up when they couldn't take care of themselves anymore, whether in a nursing home or somewhere else, they would have to figure it out on their own. I hung up on him too. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into feeling like I owed them something. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. Days turned into weeks, and I kept moving forward with my life. I got a full-time job at a company I had been working at part-time. My salary was decent, and I had benefits now. I wasn't sure if I'd stay there long-term, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own future. For so long, I had been working towards a future that was never truly mine, my parents' idea of success, their vision of what I should become. Now, I was creating my own path. Meanwhile, I heard more about my parents. They had found jobs, but it wasn't enough to keep their house. The mortgage they had taken out to fund the wedding was more than they could handle, and they were forced to sell it. To make matters worse, I found out that they had a huge pile of credit card debt. They were struggling to keep afloat, and I couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction. I hadn't heard from them since my last message, though I still received updates from relatives. Apparently, things were not looking good for my sister and her husband either. The wedding in Hawaii had been a disaster in more ways than one. They were living separately now, the pressure from her in-laws having taken its toll. Rumor had it that a divorce was imminent. As for my parents, their dream of financial salvation had fallen apart. They had put all their hopes in my sister's marriage, and now it looked like that hope was about to be shattered. It was almost poetic, in a way. They had invested so much in her wedding, in their vision of a comfortable retirement. But now, it seemed like everything was coming undone. I couldn't help but think, maybe they got what they deserved, but I wasn't going to get involved in their mess. This wasn't my problem anymore. I had my own life to live. As my vacation approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. I had been through so much over the years, sacrificing so much of myself for people who didn't even value me. But now, I had the freedom to live for myself. I thought about taking a trip to Hawaii as a sort of revenge, but that felt too much like something my parents would expect from me. I wasn't interested in following the patterns they had set for me. So, I decided against it. Instead, I started thinking about the future, my future. I was getting a real paycheck now, not just a symbolic one. I began saving for a down payment on a place of my own. I realized that I didn't need to take extravagant trips to prove that I was living my life, the freedom to make my own decisions, to live life on my own terms that was the real reward. And so, I let go of the past. I let go of my family. They had their choices, and I had mine. And in the end, I was going to choose happiness for myself.